Between last week's Supreme Court ruling regarding Louisiana's congressional map and the recent bipartisan redistricting wars across the country, some lawmakers are calling for reforms on gerrymandering. Roland Fryer joins us now. He is an economics professor at Harvard and contributor to the Wall Street Journal. Roland, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Good to see you.
So I understand you've come up with a way to use math to solve gerrymandering. Talk to me about that formula.
Yeah, basically, I won't bore you with the details, but it asks how compact can you make a state's political districting plans, meaning trying to cluster people who live together into the same political district. It is, as you say, a mathematical way of thinking about gerrymandering, and it allows us to have an objective measure to understand when a state redraws the maps, how different it is from kind of an optimal way that the math says that a state should be drawn.
And how would this realistically change the way a state's congressional district looks?
Well, in many states, a tremendous amount. For example, Tennessee is one of the states with where it would have the biggest effect, but also New York, Louisiana, et cetera. And it's not just how they look on a map. The issue I'm worried about is not a liberal or conservative view. It's about democracy. When you draw the maps correctly, like you have up, then votes matter more. So, for example, when we did our analysis, when we redrew the maps in New York according to the mathematical formula, a 1% change in voters voting Democrat, for example, or Republican, switched to a 2.5% increase in the share of seats that party obtained. Now, under the way they were drawing the maps, it was 0.5%. So in other words, if you draw the maps according to objectivity and the math, you get 5 times more responsiveness. And responsiveness here means when the voters want to elect someone, the actual outcomes are more responsive to their preferences.
Well, there are concerns from both sides, as you very well know. After last week's Supreme Court decision of Louisiana's map that created a second minority-majority district, among those concerns are that these maps could dilute the voting power of minorities. How would your method protect against that?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, District 6 in Louisiana, I follow that very carefully. The issue is allowing people to draw maps in a way that protects one constituency, allows that tool allows subjectivity in other dimensions as well. So it's a two-edged sword. What I believe is, look, the best way to do this is to just be objective and transparent and have a real metric that shows us here's what the most compact districting plans look like, and anything that deviates from that needs a true cost. Now, that's the math. There's a political decision, which is should people be able to draw maps that increase minority representation? That's a political question. What I know is when you do the math correctly, democracy flourishes.
And does that math also protect people who believe, that gerrymandering it could protect, say, a voter in rural Texas from having their vote diluted by people living in cities? In other words, is there really a way to protect all voters' interests without some level of political influence?
No, there's no free lunch. We have to make a decision on the trade-offs. And, we can say that the rural voters vote is diluted by folks who live in the city because they're outnumbered. But what I can tell you is empirically, when you show, if you move away from the way the maps are drawn now to ones that are based on this objective measure, that responsiveness increases in some places as much as 5-fold. And again, that means those voters' preferences matter more. So I can't speak to, it's really hard to design anything that's going to be perfect for every single individual voter in America. But what I can tell you is that overall, this is a much better and more democratic, in the sense of democracy, method.
And Roland, what about those who say, well, gerrymandering is just part of the political process now and that it doesn't need fixing?
Yeah, that's really dangerous. That scares me because when you anything that you do that lowers the incentives to vote, meaning if my vote doesn't matter as much because I feel like the maps have been altered in such a way that no matter what happens, the same types of candidates are going to be elected. Then, well, my incentive to vote goes down, and I participate less in our democracy. So I think just you know throwing our hands up in the air and say this is just part of politics, which I think both sides of the aisle have done now. I think that's really, really dangerous. What I think we need is we need to take a deep breath and remind ourselves of our founding principles and create an objective measure that would truly increase the power of every vote.
Roland Fryer, thank you so much for your expertise and your time on this.